China is one of the 21st century's most consequential nations. It has never been more important to understand how the country is governed and what its leaders and its people actually want and believe. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system and the trajectory of China's domestic and foreign policy. I'm your host, Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. This is Pekingology. I am very pleased to be joined today by Sarah Beran. Sarah held many senior China jobs at the State Department, the National Security Council, and the American Embassy in Beijing over the course of her 23 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. She's now with Macro Advisory Partners in New York, and I can't think of anyone with a better understanding of how U.S. China diplomacy actually works at the very highest levels of government and also at the middle levels of government where much of the work actually gets done. And I wanted to talk to Sarah for this episode because this episode will land on October 16th, about 2 weeks before President Trump is expected to meet with President Xi for the first time in his second term on the margins of the APEC summit in Korea. Trump has also said he will go to China early next year and that Xi will visit the U.S. after that. But to level with our listeners, we're recording here on October 10th. So apologies in advance if the world changes dramatically in the 6 days that will pass before you are listening to this conversation. And if the Trump-Xi summit gets canceled, I'm sure they will still meet eventually, and you can listen to this episode then. So with that throat clearing complete, Sarah, it is great to see you.
Henrietta, it's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
We like to start all of our episodes with a personal question. How did you originally become interested in China and the U.S. China relationship, and how did you get to this point in your career?
A long time ago, when I was still in high school in the early 90s, I went to China as part of a people-to-people exchange to play soccer against teams up and down the Pearl River Delta. My first travel outside the country, my first travel to China, and it was endlessly fascinating. So it started me on a course of studying Chinese at university, studying abroad in China, working in China for an American-Chinese joint venture, and then eventually joining the Foreign Service. Thought I'd spend my career doing China. 9/11 happened, and I learned Arabic and spent a good 10 years in the Middle East, but finally made it back in 2015 to Beijing and have been working China issues since.
I think this is our first sports diplomacy origin story.
Well, you've got to start somewhere.
New category.
That's right. I was terrible, I should note, and we lost every game, but it was interesting.
That's great. So let's talk about diplomacy between the United States and China. It's easy to say that maintaining channels of communication between the two most powerful nations on Earth is good and important. I've said it many times, if only to minimize the risk of misunderstanding between the two nations. But communicating with an adversary is not a simple thing, and diplomatic exchanges can easily create additional misunderstandings as well. So how do you think about setting up a meaningful conversation with an adversary you cannot trust?
It starts from a different place than speaking with an ally or a partner, but certainly there are elements that are similar. I think you have to build in a degree of predictability into the engagements. And that stands in for trust in some ways because the two sides can predict or understand how the other will respond. And it starts from a very low base, right? When we were setting up the channel between the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and Wang Yi, the director of the Office of Central Foreign Affairs Commission, we started with the logistics, right? So walking them through it, creating predictability about what it would look like. And this was important. It was the first meeting after the balloon incident when the relationship really plummeted to levels not seen in some time. And that predictability about what a meeting would look like, what the topics would be, what the statements would look like after, I think stood in for trust at that point. And we repeated that approach of predictability in the engagements, both at senior levels, but also at working levels, to help build in something that could stand in for trust.
So in a way, the process itself can build momentum towards stability in the relationship.
That's exactly right. And that's certainly the case when it reaches senior level engagement, right? Where the very fact of a meeting and a press statement afterward indicates that at least the two sides are talking and sort of steadies everything on both sides. I think different administrations have come at this differently. This administration seems to be quite focused on using unpredictability and volatility as a way to keep the Chinese off balance. But there is a cost to that, even as you're keeping them off balance. And perhaps that is useful in negotiations. It is less useful in maintaining serious communications about issues of national security import, whether it's cross-strait or South China Sea or Russia.
So to make this a little more concrete, we can think about APEC. You were the lead planner for 2 of these APEC meetings between the American and Chinese presidents in 2023 and 2024. And I know you spent a very large amount of time working out the details with Chinese counterparts. So I actually want to start with your sense of the Chinese side of this process. In Beijing, like, how does this work? How do they prepare for these summits and what are they trying to achieve?
Good question. And I should say I was not doing this alone. I had an amazing team, including Henrietta, for a good chunk of the prep, which made it a lot easier. I think going into a senior level, a presidential level engagement, it's important to have a clear line of communication to prep. So you need an authorized channel on both sides. You need a clear understanding of what you want out of the engagement. Are there deliverables? Is this for optics? Are there serious discussions that are going to happen behind closed doors that may not be apparent outside, but at least are part of clearing up the misperception and miscommunication that you talked about, Henrietta? On the Chinese side, again, we're looking at this from a little bit of a black box. So I can tell you what I observed. Certainly not all of their prep was visible from the outside. But I think on their side, there was also an attempt to comb through their interagency and see what their asks are. What did they want out of the engagement? What was important, not just to the leader, but to their bureaucracy too. So the process was very bottom up for them in leadership, in leader level meeting prep. There was also an acute focus on the optics and on the pomp and circumstance around a meeting. And I think that is because a big part of what they wanted, the Chinese side wanted out of a meeting, was a signal to the rest of the world that the U.S. and China were meeting as equals, two leaders, and that the relationship was stable enough that there could be productive conversations. So they wanted positive optics out of the meeting. That desire for positive optics drives things like requests for certain types of photo ops or certain types of meeting setups. And so sometimes in a leader level prep, it's not just about the big weighty issues like resuming counter narcotics cooperation or understandings on AI and safety and risk, which are two things that both came out of Woodside, but also did the two leaders get a moment where they're walking and they get a picture together? That kind of piece is also an important part of the preparations for a summit.
So there's the, do they get a picture together?
Mm.
There's the, are we going to cooperate on fentanyl? I think culturally, it often seems like on the US side, we get a little more focused on the tactical side of the ledger. Like, what are the specific things we're going to agree on or not agree on? And maybe on the Chinese side, traditionally, there's been more focus on this optic, the feel of the meeting as a key metric of success. And so how does that disconnect in what the two sides see as most substantive affect the conversation itself and how you think about planning a useful exchange?
I think the different nature in which we approach a meeting like that is reflective of the very different nature of our two systems. So for the Chinese side, Beijing essentially wants a signal that they can send through the rest of their system on where the relationship is headed. So in preparing for the Woodside Summit, for example, in 2023, the Chinese side was very focused on what language are we going to use to talk about the relationship? What adjectives are we going to use to describe what bilateral relations are like? And for us, for the United States, that is generally secondary, right? Adjectives in a statement don't seem to matter. But for the Chinese side, that was a very important point. And again, I think that is about signaling both internally in their own system about the direction of the relationship, but also externally to other partners as well. That drives, I think, a disconnect in the prep channels. And for example, when we were prepping or trying to set up some type of understanding or reset on counter narcotics, where the Chinese would take certain actions ahead of or in close proximity to the summit, it meant that we couldn't really have that conversation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the normal prep channel for leader level engagement. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs doesn't control counter narcotics and law enforcement, and they are a peer of the ministry that does. And so we had to find another channel to have that prep conversation with in the Chinese system. You'll hear throughout prep for summits that talk of channel, and it really does matter because particularly on the Chinese side, each ministry has its set of issues it can work on, and it is not empowered in the same way that the National Security Council used to be on the United States side to stretch across the interagency and pull in all those different inputs. They can ask for input, but they can't in the same way leverage the centralized power to get the other ministries to take action or do something. That has to come from the very top. And for that reason, too, that is why a presidential level meeting is so important, because it is only when you kick all the way up to that level that there is the power to get things done outside the normal foreign ministry channels.
And in that process, in the Chinese interagency, who are the important players aside from Xi himself?
It depends on the issue set. So for counter-narcotics, it was the Ministry of Public Security and the State Counselor and Minister Wang Xiaohong. On anything to do with strategic, cross-strait foreign policy issues, it was Wang Yi as the now Foreign Minister and Director of the Office of Central Foreign Affairs Commission. On economic issues, Vice Premier, now He Lifeng, but in the past Liu He, had the lead. And so finding a way to have these conversations in different channels to move action forward is critical. I'll come back again. You can have those channels running and trying to talk through different issues, but it isn't until you get a leader level meeting on the Chinese side that really energizes the entire system to come up with a deliverable or to be pressed to actually come to the table with something. It is very rare to have the Chinese side put what they want on the table in a discussion. They will generally wait until they see what our list of asks is and then respond, which can be incredibly frustrating in a negotiation because revealing your opening bid or bottom line first is often setting out on a back foot.
And in these meetings, how does the private messaging, this back and forth, who's putting what on the table, correspond to what we see publicly, either in the formal readouts of the meeting or how both sides describe what occurred? Like, what are the best tea leaves we can read to understand what's actually going on in these meetings?
It's imperfect, but I think a very good way of parsing out where differences are and where gaps may be emerging are the two statements. And this isn't just at a leader level engagement, even when the National Security Advisor and Wang Yi met, or the Secretary of State and Wang Yi met, or other counterparts. If you can see how the two sides are referring to the same issue set, you can start to parse where the differences are and where the convergence is. Normally in a negotiation on a deliverable, say restarting counter-narcotics cooperation or the AI risk and safety issues, or mill-mill, restarting mill-mill channels, you'd want to see those deliverables referred to the same or pretty close to the same in both statements. That is normally part of a negotiation, and that helps ensure that both systems have the same understanding of what the to-do list is. If you start to see statements that emerge that are totally different, to me, that indicates there's a disconnect. And I would point to the statements after the trade rounds between Secretary Besant and He Lifeng as being pretty different, which to me either indicates someone was not paying attention to the statements or there are real differences remaining in the way the two sides view TikTok or various other trade measures.
So you can talk about the value of coordinated language across these statements, but it's been, I think, quite a while since we saw a joint statement issued from the U.S. and China together, maybe aside from climate. So could you talk about the significance of that evolution?
I will say, as a former diplomat, I was very, very glad to see when we started moving away from identical statements, a coordinated one statement, because the amount of work that went into wordsmithing over every single sentence was, as we would say, the juice was not worth the squeeze. There would be negotiating sessions, I remember, during President Obama's time, where we would be up to 3 or 4 in the morning, day after day after day, trying to get to the same language. And it simply, in my view, is not a good use of time. Instead, and I think what we moved to for President Biden's statements was a statement on both sides, so separate statements, where the U.S. side in its language would talk about the issues it raised and the concerns it had, which you could never get in a truly joint statement, right? So concerns about peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, concerns about South China Sea, concerns about China's support for Russia's defense industrial base. We ensured that was reflected in the statement because we talked about it in the meeting and it was important to communicate that was still a concern. And then we would generally negotiate a smaller portion of the statement where there was overlap, where the two sides had agreed, for example, to restart mill-mill communications. And there we negotiated how we would refer to that. and what channels were restarted. We generally, again, this was a Chinese side ask, but I think it was useful, would coordinate how we referred to the meeting, what adjectives we used. The reason for that was, again, so that we were both portraying to our respective publics a similar view of how the meeting went, whether it was constructive, whether it was frank. It seems meaningless, but in diplomatic speak, I think those small shifts in adjectives were noteworthy.
Just to put a finer point on this, I mean, we're talking about like very long conversations about whether the meeting was constructive or productive, with both sides, I think, sometimes feeling that vastly different impressions.
That is fair. That is fair. And I will say we did not spend too much time on adjectives, just for those of you worried about waste of taxpayer dollars.